You are all here, I assume, for this discussion. The title is A Long Time Coming, with a question mark, significantly, Obama and the Politics of Identity. My name is Bill Sewell. I teach in the political science and history departments here at the University of Chicago. And I am a fellow of the Center for Contemporary Theory, fondly known as 3CT. 3CT is the sponsor of this event. And it's my privilege to introduce our distinguished speakers, Cathy Cohen and Adolph Reed. This program is one of a series of events in a lecture series that 3CT is sponsoring on identity and politics. I assume that some of you were at a previous event we held back in December that was also focused on the presidential election and the Obama phenomenon that featured Lauren Berlant and Michael Dawson. I want to also thank the Franke Center for providing us with space, obviously. And for those of you who don't know about 3CT, there's a sign-up sheet actually just outside the door for anyone who wants to get more information about us and our doings. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Adolph Reed is a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. He may be known to some of you as the author of some rather critical articles on Barack Obama and the phenomenon of Obamism that appeared in The Nation. He is a prolific scholar, most of whose work has centered on one or another aspect of African American politics. He's the author of many books, including Stirrings in the Jug, Black Politics in the Post-Segregation Era, 1999, W.E.B. Du Bois and American Political Thought, Fabianism and the Color Line, 1997, The Jesse Jackson Phenomenon, The Crisis of Purpose in Afro-American Politics, 1986, and also in 1986, Race, Politics, and Culture, Critical Essays on Radicalism of the 1960s. According to his website, he's working on a couple of book projects at present, one with the title Making Sense of Race, What It Is, What It Isn't, Why It Matters, Why It Doesn't, and another to be called When Compromises Come Home to Roost, The American Left's Retreat from Class Struggle and the Rise of Neoliberalism. Cathy Cohen is my colleague in the political science department here at Chicago, where she is the David and Mary Winton Green Professor. Her work has focused above all on the politics of race, gender, and sexuality. She's the author of The Boundaries of Blackness, AIDS and the Breakdown of Black Politics, published in 1999. 1999, is that right? Yeah, 1999. Yes. All right.
A long time coming.
Long time coming. Yeah, long time coming. As well as many book articles and books chapters, she's currently working on what is known as the Black Youth Project, which uses diverse methodologies to investigate the attitudes, the culture, and experiences of a wide range of African American young people. Cathy has also shouldered much more than her share of administrative burdens of this university, and we're grateful to her for that. She served brilliantly as the director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and is now the deputy provost for graduate education. So graduate students present, she's the one who's protecting your bacon. All of this while carrying on her career as a teacher and a research scholar. This program is not going to be, a lecture and another lecture and then comments. Rather, it's going to be set up as a discussion. So Adolph and Cathy are going to launch into a discussion of the whatever it is they want to discuss. Whenever any of you wants to break into the discussion, hold up your hand. And I think I'll leave it to you, to the two of you, to call on people, you know, when you see fit.
Okay.
You don't have to call on them right away. You can finish your point, for sure. I'll only intervene if you know, things get too crazy. So, without further ado, go ahead.
Okay. Well, we're not in Manhattan, so things probably won't get too crazy. But thanks, Bill and Cathy and the Center and everyone else you know, for putting this on. It's also nice to be back in Chicago and in this neighborhood and in this state Senate district. Anyway, well, it's kind of hard to say where to start. I mean, and you gave, you know, really open-ended options. I was thinking, well, I could say I want to talk about Barry Bonds, or about you know, you know, most pressing one of the 5 most pressing evils in the world, which is Duke University men's basketball team. But I guess the question is what Obama's presidency, or the question that convenes us here, is what Obama's presidency says about identity politics. Right? Is that a pithy way to put it? And it's a question I've been grappling with. I've been trying to write about this, actually. Some of you may know I'm in the midst of trying to finish a short book that is already overdue on that question, partly on that question. It's complex. The more I think about it, the more I think that answering the question, and this is, you know, one of the reasons the book isn't done, it requires first making more historical sense about what identity politics, or what we call identity politics, right? You know, I mean, even that is a sort of problematic notion in a couple of different ways. One, it's identity politics is kind of like race from one perspective, right? We all know what we mean to refer to by it, right? But the fact of the matter is that when you start to think about the relation between politics and identity, it becomes increasingly difficult to distill certain strains of political activity, you know, under the rubric, you know, identitarian, and others under some other rubric. I mean, in the U.S., typically, or rather in American academic life, because really nobody else talks about identity politics or anything like that, or in that language. In the contemporary American Academy, when you know, the opposite of identity politics, typically in this conversation, especially to the extent that it's a debate, is something called class politics, and what that means is just as complex and multifarious and contested, I suppose it is a way to put it, as what is generally considered in this discourse community as identity politics, right? And as a number, many critics on both sides of this artificial debate have pointed, or this artificially construed debate have pointed out, class is as much a form of identity as these others, right? So, what to do? Well, of course, you know, there's no question that's so simple and clean and straightforward that an academic can't make much more complex. That's kind of how we roll, right? But increasingly, I've been thinking specifically, right, about the Obama phenomenon, which is actually a construction I've tried not to use, just partly for a selfish reason. I don't want to be known as the phenomenon guy. But you know, the different narratives that have condensed around Obama, it seems to me, you know, more and more to make sense, you know, to really get a handle on what's going on, I think requires trying to understand this partly in relation to the emergence and the evolution of a notion of race relations and the politics of race relations, which makes things a little more complicated still because, and I'm going to shut up in a minute, you know, because there are at least 2 or 3 different ways to sort of track the genesis of the idea of race relations, right? Or at least two or three different starting points, which suggest different warrants about how we should think about what this thing is. One is the emergence of liberal racial ideology in the post-war American racial liberalism that emerged in a specific historical context in the response to specific challenges and conflicts and political dynamics. A second is to sort of push the meter of history back a little farther and try to situate the emergence of post-war racial liberalism partly as an intellectual historical phenomenon, partly out of the academic regime of race relations scholarship that emerged in the 1920s, 1930s, in large measure, around the corner from here, basically, as did so much, and in fact, well, I'll come back to that plug later. But now I have another plug. Yet a third and more interesting, and still more interesting, tack calls for pushing the meter of history back a little farther, and to take up the challenge posed by a very, very interesting book that came out a couple of years ago, and that apparently no one's paid attention to because people were apparently waiting for the apology, for Booker T. Washington to come out. Right? It is, that time in our history. It's always time for a new apology. But an historian named Michael West did a book that was published in '06 called "The Education of Booker T. Washington," in which he lays out the very interesting argument that Washington was the founder of the notion of race relations, not as a theory, but he instantiated it through a kind of political practice, and partly through his autobiography. In the sense that, and the story that Michael West tells is that, okay, from whenever you want to start it, right, until the Civil War, the way that black Americans figured into national political life and to national political discourse was, of course, primarily as the Negro problem. And the form that the Negro problem took up to emancipation was, what the hell are we going to do with them? We can we keep them as slaves forever? And if we can't, then what happens? Can we absorb them? Everybody knows the Thomas Jefferson story, who was convinced during the daylight hours that the races could never coexist. Things looked a little differently once the sun went down, apparently. But and then with emancipation after the Civil War, the nature of the question changes. And in fact, you don't talk quite so much about the Negro problem because black people are in this 30-year period of contestation geared toward establishing, well, not geared toward, but that was substantively driven by efforts to establish what an autonomous and an independent life, within the American political economy and the polity would look like. What forms it would take, how it would be enacted. So to that extent, from roughly the period, and I can feel real historians cringing at this, but at this kind of crude, at this sort of crude periodization. But from the period roughly from the end of the Civil War to the final, to the quashing of the final embers of the Reconstruction experiment, it was rather more an open question as to whether blacks could, in fact, wind up being part of the American polity and not a special problem to be administered. Long story short, old story condensed. The victory of white supremacy at the end of the 19th century takes blacks out of civic life and then leaves the question, and sort of leaves the question of the Negro problem, right? But, I mean, here's the rub, that there is a sort of the racial liberalism of the day could have handled, according to West's argument, blacks not being equal members of the society when they were slaves, because their status was defined as outside the polity. But after but in the Jim Crow era, right, there was a problem, right? And the problem, as West characterizes it, is that blacks were clearly not slaves and were protected by the Constitution, but there was an understanding that they, that the South had basically won, or the planter South had basically won, and the challenge for Northern liberals was how to accommodate themselves to this reality. Well, then West's argument is, up comes Washington, as it were, to propose a way to sidestep this problem of the Negro problem through positing what used to be called the Negro problem as a problem of the relation between the races. And as he argues, blacks then cease to appear at all as farmers, teachers, fathers, mothers, children, students, stonemasons. They are Negroes, and the social and the question of unequal social relations then becomes recast not as a question of equality or of inequality or of injustice or anything like that, but as a matter of the relation between the races. And more specifically, to the extent that there's a problem, the problem is understood as bad race relations. Well, if the problem is bad race relations, then what's the alternative? Then what's the solution? The solution has to be good race relations. And you can have good race relations without having justice, without having equality. You can have good race relations simply by not having lynching or black people being able to complain or this, that, and the other. All right. So this, then, West argues, is the fundamental, is the essential logic of the notion of race, of the race relations that began to take shape in American political discourse in the early 20th century. And in fact, I'm sure, that for some people at least, the notion race adjustment, will come to mind. That's how, that's, the strategic imperative of what I might now call race relations engineering at the in the period around the First World War was to adjust the relations between the races so that people like the sociologist, I guess he was technically a mathematician, Kelly Miller, actually did a book called Race Adjustment, and people talked about it constantly. All right. So this, then, according to West, is the rational kernel of this ideology, from which eventually emerged the philanthropic efforts to negotiate the black migration and incorporation of blacks into cities, the links between Carnegie and always, right, the University of Chicago is just sort of throbbing here. And this was even before that one block of 57th became one way going east for reasons that nobody could understand. I'll just kind of, I could take the story up to World War II. I think the post-war, I think the evolution of post-war racial liberalism is a better known and a more reflected on story, and one that would be interesting for us to talk about. I think I will just end at this point by saying that I think to answer the question that's the source of the original provocation, it requires certainly making sense of what Obama's election or his emergence and election, the whole schmear, says, or how it connects to how it emerges out of how we've all come to think about race and this thing called race relations in the post-war period.
I don't see any hands, so I'll go for it. Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
So, first I want to thank 3CT. I want to thank everybody here for coming. Hopefully we're going to have an engaged, contentious, exciting discussion. I said I was thrilled to be here because Adolph is probably at least one of the people who is more negative about Obama than I am. So I had a little cover, so to speak. And I should start by saying I'm not, you're not going to like this, not necessarily negative. You're like, oh, she's backtracking already.
No.
I got to live here. I got to live here.
Subcapital.
That's right. Yeah. But I do think this is a moment for us to have some kind of critical reflection on the Obama presidency, our understanding of identity politics, the mobilization of identity politics, both the positive and the negative, the question of long time coming and what is it that in fact has arrived. Because we might argue that in many ways it is an extension of a history or trajectory of black politics that has seen us move from elected public officials in the late 60s, 1970s that were in clearly racially contentious districts and elections to what I've called kind of a second wave that became more technocratic black mayors who deracialized, if possible, at times their elections to hold public office that Adolph has talked about brilliantly in terms of kind of the systems of governing that these mayors ascribed to that neglected communities and neglected black communities in particular to go with corporate interests in the need for resources as a tax base left. I mean, and then there's this what I have called kind of the third wave of I guess we can call them black politicians. And in this kind of third wave, I would put President Obama, I would put Deval Patrick, and the always aspiring Cory Booker as examples of this new generation of what I would say are kind of race leaders, not race leaders. Because I think, in fact, for them, the category of being raced is being imposed on them. In fact, they see themselves as transcending that period. But let's just say maybe a little bit about let me say a few things about identity politics, and we can kind of get this moving, which is, there is a way in which there's an argument that, and I think we've all said it, we have to remember that President Obama is a politician and a centrist, center-left, let's say. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt today, and say a center-left politician. But for good or bad, that is what he is. And I remind myself of that whenever I read something that he's done, and I ask this question. You know that question, what would Jesus do? Well, some of you do. I don't ask that question. I ask, what would Hillary have done?
Oh, I thought you were going to say
Hamlet. And if Hillary would have done the same thing, then it seems to me, in fact, we have a centrist Clinton-esque politics continuing that maybe was in abeyance for 8 years, but now has kind of reemerged. Now, in those more cynical moments when I think, oh, he's a centrist politician, I also have to recognize the kind of symbolic importance of Obama, and I've had to deal with that in a way that I didn't want to. I wanted to just kind of analyze him in terms of his appointments, what his cabinet looked like, who was contained in the cabinet, but every day I'm reminded of the kind of symbolic importance of Barack Obama to all sorts of people who have been kind of marginalized, made invisible, neglected, and who have been silenced. Now, I might make the argument that in many ways their lives do not change with President Obama. But I am not going to deny them kind of the centrality that they believe, at least the symbolic representation of Barack Obama has in terms of some form of identity politics that either moves them to the polls or gives them a different attachment to the state, which I think could be, in fact, dangerous. But, you know, when I went into, I think it was Subway, and the young black man was waiting on me, he was like, hey, hey, we got a black president. I was like, yeah, I know. You know, you know, I remember the day of the election, going out to get the paper at 6 a.m., and there were these two young black men with their hoodies walking down the street. Now, you know, I wasn't worried. I was behind my gate and everything, but they were, and I wouldn't have been worried anyway, but they said, hey, we're going to vote. And it was like, wow, you know, I want this to happen. But then there's the question of kind of the long-term impact of this type of identity mobilization. And I worry about identity in the other aspects of what I would truly call identity politics, and really the history of what we've seen with identity politics, especially in the work that we do around kind of black communities. Mm-hmm. We've both seen kind of the demobilization of poor black communities when, in fact, black elected officials have neglected the needs of those communities and have decided, in fact, that their re-election campaigns are probably advanced by demobilizing those communities. We've seen, at least I felt like I saw in this last election, the presidential election, the unwillingness of colleagues, of individuals who have the media's attention to engage in a kind of debate, deliberation about what Barack Obama means for black voters and black communities. And so in many ways I'm worried about an identity politics that has shut down deliberation and discussion and really kind of the fundamentals of supposedly what is the democratic process. I worry about identity politics under a black president that allows a racialized state to continue to target black and Latino and Asian American and folks of color and poor people and an expanding group of what we might call kind of the expanded underclass, mm-hmm. right, gays and lesbians, under the pretense that these can't be racialized policies, in fact, if you have the head of state as a black man, right? And so you have a racialized state that has the cover of being non-racial, because, in fact, some people believe that since Barack is there, that means that, you know, racism no longer exists. I worry about a racialized politics that, an identity politics that we've talked about also before that kind of glosses over the significant differences that exist in communities of color and in black communities, where suddenly, and you've said this, you've written about this also, and that in many ways,
as have you.
As have you. No, but I was going to say this part also. Well, we both have written about this. That, you know, and if you begin to kind of look at President Obama's, and I would argue, attacks on poor black people and attacks on black youth, some of those attacks are to the right of Clinton. Yeah. Some of them are, you know, the don't feed your children, Popeyes, you know, you all need to, like, stop wearing sagging pants, and you got a bad attitude, and he references them as Pookie, and Cousin Pookie. Well, he, in different cases, there's a Cousin Pookie, there's a Pookie, and I'm just telling you, I know he doesn't know a Pookie, but that's all right. I know a Pookie, but he doesn't know a Pookie. So I do worry about also kind of an identity politics that allows a pretty vicious attack on poor people of color under the auspices of this is tough love from inside the community, right? I worry about an identity politics that doesn't demand an explicit articulation of how the policies being promoted by this administration is going to impact, in particular, again, poor people of color and poor black people. I mean, my dear friend Barbara Ransby have talked about this. She's talked about kind of the fact that, you know, we won one election, and what about the 2 million people who are still incarcerated, right? What about the fact that 50% of all HIV/AIDS cases are from black communities? What about the fact that 20% of the population in D.C. is HIV positive, right? So how do we deal with identity politics that both at some level can be uplifting, right? But that also can be damaging, I think, to the type of mobilization that you've in particular talked about that needs to happen to hold not only President Obama accountable, but any kind of electoral official accountable. So in that sense, it seems to me a long time coming, it's kind of the same situation. But I don't want to, again, negate the significance of the symbolic nature of what it is to have a black man, emphasis on black man, as the head of this thing.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe I'll stop.
Yeah, can I say a couple
yeah,
things?
Please.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I knew, and I assume you knew too, and I hope that nobody in the audience was expecting anything different, because you'd be disappointed, because this wouldn't be a mud wrestling event, since we are very close to each other in our views on this stuff. I guess a couple things. One of them is, I mean, just one little point about granting people the moment of elation. Okay, I certainly understand that, right? And I mean, I was out on election day just like everybody else was, and could see it, and days before and days after. One little anecdote. Okay, my father was a World War II veteran, and he was one of FDR's prisoners for peace or of peace in Belgium after World War II. When they didn't want to demobilize men and bring them home because they couldn't be absorbed into the labor market. He was in Belgium when Roosevelt died, and he was in the theater watching the newsreel, that used to show before films back in the day. And they would do a man in the street thing, or a person in the street thing, and asked a black woman in Harlem what she thought about FDR's having died. And this was the first she heard of it, and she was stunned, and she fell to her knees and was crying and said, "Oh God, what are we going to do? What are we going to do?" And we can understand why. But my father said his reaction when he was sitting there in the theater was, "Well, I know what you're going to do. You're going to get up and go downtown and clean out a white woman's kitchen today, just like you did yesterday, and just like you did tomorrow," right? So I mean, it's got to be necessary to hold both things in one's head at the same time. I mean, for us anyway, because that's part of the curse of doing what we do for a living, right? To hold both, to hold that contradiction in one's head. To appreciate, cherish, and even revel in, the moment of elation that people have. It's kind of like the church thing, as far as I'm concerned. That's one observation. I think the other, has to do with your last point. I think I think is right, but this is exactly the thing I've been trying to grapple with. That there are ways in which this is something different, and in which it's not something different at the same time. From one perspective, I mean, this is a fulfillment, or the fulfillment, of a particular notion of equality of opportunity that the NAACP had embraced for most of its history, right? And even strains of black power, right? I mean, I remember Nathan Wright, or his brother, one of the Wrights, the Black Wright brothers. Laid out as an agenda for black power in the late 1960s, that black people should be 12% of everything, right? 12% of the corporate boards, 12% of the unemployed, 12% of everything in the middle. Now, that's one notion of racial equity, and it certainly makes sense as notions of racial equity go. I mean, I don't do the kind of political theorizing that my president at the University of Pennsylvania does. So I'm not sure, but that's one. And there is a sense then in which Obama's election is a fulfillment of one of the contested, one of the objectives of the contested struggle for black Americans' justice in the United States, right? At the same time, obviously there are ways in which it isn't the fulfillment of much, actually, right? Except a nice thing for him, right? I thought of another anecdote. I mean, Chris Rock's bit about the O.J. Simpson trial, right? But he said, I went to my mailbox every day for 2 weeks looking for my O.J. prize, and it just never popped up. And most black people aren't getting that Barack Obama prize either. But that's not his fault, right? And so this is the fulfillment of something, but then, what it is the fulfillment of is itself complex and contested, right?
No, I was going to agree, and people should. Oh, you got a hand up already. But I'll just finish this. It'll take all of 1 second, which is there is this kind of question of demographic representation, but then it gets even more difficult because, in fact, who does he represent, right? There is a way in which we have, I think, easily erased the kind of his own kind of immigrant history by a nice gesture or categorization of African American. Now, part of it, I think, is the way in which, in this country, we generally can't handle, right, the complexity of race and the ways in which folks of color, in particular, can have kind of multiple relationships, both to a racial ancestry that is here and elsewhere and things of that sort. Yep. Now, he I think also has, I dare say, manipulated that also, right? So there is a way in which I feel like, and I think you would probably agree, that there is a movement in terms of his racial promise, I would say, his racial status and his racial promise. And so he can be a quote-unquote authentic black man who can preach about fatherhood, even though we could question kind of what are the indicators of good fatherhood. And if part of it is being present and you're an elected official and you're never present, we might wonder, like, do you have the status to talk about fatherhood?
And in fact, we could also we could also question what it means not to have a father, since he didn't have one and he's president.
Right.
Right. I mean, it didn't handicap him very much. So.
Exactly. Right. There's the way in which there's a racial authenticity, I think, also that happens through Michelle Obama, right? That for everybody who's not quite sure, I've heard this on more than one occasion, we should really be comfortable and proud and happy that he married a black woman. Right. Like that was that was a real hard thing for him to do. Well, at least he married a black woman. But I do think there's this kind of moment of kind of what's the racial promise here. There's almost a wink-wink with, I think, black communities that we've seen before with black elected officials, which is, just hold off, don't press me. Right. Once I get in, I'm going to take care of you, right? And we've seen it also from many of his supporters who have said, stop complaining, don't raise these issues, just hold on when he gets there.
We'll come back for you.
We'll come back for you. But the other part of this is, I think, these firsts, where he's like the first black president, I think he's also making a promise sometimes to white people that says, I'm the first, but this will be the last time you'll have to talk about this, right? So the promise is not just about first, but it's an ending. Like, we're going to end the discussion about kind of racial inequality or kind of systemic racism because, in fact, you've allowed me to be president. I just think the kind of political, Bob was disagreeing, but the political, I think, that's good. I think the political landscape just changes significantly, right? Especially whenever there's a kind of, an office that's not kind of based on a racialized districting, right? So his kind of constituency of legitimacy, I've said this before, is not the black community, right? His constituency legitimacy were really those Iowa voters who said, you know what, white Iowa voters who said, this guy is viable.
Yeah,
right?
although if you want to go back to basics, it's these people right here.
Oh, well, yeah, his Hyde Park constituency?
Yeah, right, and this is where the baby came from.
Well,
so, I mean, let's be real about it.
I don't think it's, well, I don't think this group,
No,
as
no,
much
no,
as I
no,
love
no,
them,
no, no.
they don't have enough power to give anybody legitimacy, right? Because they,
No, but I mean,
they've
at the
already
opening of
written off.
their career.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
It's happened in Hyde Park.
Right, and
to
then
some
moved
degree.
out from there.
Right.
Right.
But it wasn't because of
No, no,
this
no.
group.
No.
Not this
No,
group,
I
but
mean
Hyde Park
personalizing
in
the
general.
people.
Right.
Right.
There were two people who had hands. Martha.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. I'm wondering, what if we move our discussion even bigger than Hyde Park and think about it, identity politics globally, and think about what this might represent as kind of a turning point. I mean, as we know, right, this neoliberal order is global, and in some ways it means that sort of we have now the global north and the global south kind of come home. So if we think of like American poor of color as in some way part of the global south with this fast-paced kind of freedom of capital to sort of move, to have no national borders, and how that impacts then Americans themselves and reconfigures their identities. And then now at the same juncture, right, we have a president with some kind of international resume. Clearly there's people around the globe who have, in the same way the young man at Subway had a symbolic representation. I mean, that was happening globally
Absolutely.
in an interesting way. So we often talk about in the academy, going back to the reference of, placing identity politics in the academy. I mean, another variation of that that's really been forceful in the last few years is to talk about transnational political affiliation, transnational activism. And I wonder if this is a moment to think about transnational identity politics, whether on a grassroots way or even on a leadership way. Like how we think about, are there some openings for people to push either new theorizing, new organizing, new alliances globally around some kind of transnational identity?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think my hesitation is that I think, at least from the standpoint of the U.S., most of the discussion of transnational politics or transnational popular politics is kind of a hydroponic one, right? I mean, in the sense that I think the biggest problem that we've got here is that there's no really organically rooted oppositional politics that's got any institutional base in this country at all, and it may very well be a failing of my imagination because I don't have much of it anyway. But it's kind of hard for me to, as much as I would like to see, how to make the move to construct the kind of transnational alliances that you mentioned. I just can't see in whose name or what the popular forces there are here that would be capable of constructing it. I mean, you look at the labor movement, for instance, which is really the only locus of any kind of institutionalized left-of-center politics in the United States that's got any popular capacity. Apart from, there were some interesting things going on that front with some small unions like the UE, with the Unite side of Unite Here, but it looks like that union may be on the verge of dissolving again anyway. I don't know. I mean, I'm at the same time I'm really happy that you put the real N word on the table, which is neoliberalism, right? Because I think that at least on the domestic front, I think one of the one process that Obama's election may have accelerate or may accelerate is what I've been calling, for want of a better way to characterize it, is sort of re-racialization, right? By which I mean a kind of at least partial disconnection of racial discourse from phenotype, and that we can find ourselves, I mean, going back to when Bill Weld was the governor of Massachusetts. A friend of mine there said, "Oh yeah, I mean, he did something. He made some expression of tolerance about gays and blacks." And my friend said, "Yeah, he loves gays and blacks and women as long as they're rich, but otherwise they can go to jail and go to hell, right?" And I think one of the things that we see, like with the call the dog by its right name, but the sort of class consolidation of this black black, largely Ivy, but elite university-trained cohort of, aspirants to the highest reaches of the professional managerial classes are, this is like another step of their incorporation their incorporation into the ruling class, right? I'll just be as crude and old-style Marxist as you expect me to be. And especially to the extent that this move, this incorporation does fulfill one goal of one strain of the civil rights movement, then it is what it is, right? And it's multi-sided, right? But it is what it is. And it does have the potential, I think, for creating exactly the kind of ideological noise, right, that you were talking about, Cathy. While further cementing, see, I think one of the things that's happened with us, and granted, I mean, this sort of takes us back, from your question to the earlier, brief about, the debates around what identity politics is that increasingly over the last 25 to 30 years, we've found ourselves in American political discourse in which the only, in fact longer really, the only recognized language of injustice is a language of ascripted injustice, right? Racism, sexism, heterosexism, et cetera. And this fits very nicely, within the neoliberal framework, right? I mean, we can celebrate diversity, right? We can open opportunity structures, but while sort of deracializing or rather re-racializing, the underclass, right? On and at least partly or more loosely, or partly non-phenotypic or more loosely phenotypic basis, right? I can imagine, for instance, seeing a race of pedophiles, right? I mean, just from the way the discourse goes, right? The resurgence of all kinds of genetic determinism, right? Reopens the potential for creating of all sorts of, or for the emergence of, all sorts of de facto racial groups that need to be monitored, controlled, which of course would disproportionately overlap the the currently stigmatized groups that are defined by phenotype, because that becomes, the truth that makes it work on a folk level anyway. And there's a sense in which, I'm struck. I mean, partly because of, to be completely honest about it, Obama and the crowd around him are those people that we all in this room know very well. The older ones of us, like me, taught a bunch of them at Yale in the 80s, and they would, go home from whatever they were doing to watch the Cosby Show to, sort of model, their appropriate black upper class behavior, and completely understood that the purpose of the civil rights movement was for them to be able to go to work at Morgan Stanley and stuff. And this has happened, right? So, I mean, this is a stratum that is now being incorporated. And, like from, as I said before, there are multiple metrics of justice, and none of them emerges from nature. And, this is one, and I grant that this is one, right? If you're going to have a sharply class polarized neoliberal order, then it's less undemocratic if people are permitted access to it without regard for invidious ascriptive status. That's a little bit like saying for, to me, saying for a pygmy is a real good rebounder, but that's a metric of justice that could work. So, I apologize because I know that I've taken your question and gone someplace entirely different with it, right? But I think I did give my response to it initially.
Okay.
I'll punt.
I'll be very quick. So, Martha, I don't know if I have a broader imagination than Adolph in terms of the ability to see the possibility for transnational, international organizing. Maybe it's because, in fact, I watch the young people that I'm surrounded by do all sorts of organizing that don't look like traditional union organizing that, in fact, I think has a huge impact. It may not be connected in terms of the traditional sources of kind of chapters or affiliations. There may not be kind of the centralized bureaucratic structure, and you might argue, in fact, because of the loose structure, it doesn't have the same ability, in fact, to mobilize, to gain resources, to act as a really kind of transformative and demanding force with regards to the state or the economy. But I do think that there's something to be learned even from the Obama organizing that we saw both online and offline, right? And that we've seen the kind of transnational organizing we've seen for quite some time, the ways in which ideas and methods and tactics, in fact, are kind of dispersed or delivered to other parts of the world where there isn't a kind of face-to-face interaction. We know that from the study of social movements. We know, in fact, that there are also other ways in which people organize around social movements, the whole idea of kind of new social movements, which look very different than kind of traditional social movements. So I think there's the potential, and I think there is the potential, again, with the symbolic nature of the Obama administration being open. Now, on the other hand, I think there's the actual kind of policies that we've seen, the deployment of more troops in Afghanistan, the lack of clarity about when, in fact, troops will be leaving Iraq, right? The absence of any discussion around Gaza. So we, again, can have an opening in terms of the appearance of a different type of internationalist agenda that doesn't necessarily move very far from a very centralist agenda that we might have seen under the Clinton administration. And now we have, in fact, another Clinton implementing that agenda. So I think that you've hit on something important, which is there's Obama and everything that maybe he represents and the problems and possibilities with that administration, and then there's the work of organizing. The real work of kind of transforming this moment. And, he says it all the time, this isn't about me, it's about we, or it's about you. My concern is actually more that he is capturing, and I've argued this before, and I've heard to the contrary, so I hope that's true, that he's capturing some of the mobilization that we might have expected to hold him accountable. That some of the best organizers, some of the best innovators, some of the best tech people are actually moving into the Obama administration, not the administration, but his kind of, his bureau apparatus, exactly. What is it, Organizing for America? Now, I know that there are people in the audience who have seen something different than that, and that's what I think we have to really focus in on, is how do we build institutions, or how do we support institutions that can understand themselves as both holding Barack and that administration accountable, at the same time as promoting his agenda when, in fact, it does match the needs and the issues and the concerns of folks in their different, whether it be identity groups, affiliations, or communities. So to me, that's the possibility of globalization, but I don't necessarily believe it's going to be led by his administration and his policies.
Oh, about you.
So I have a couple of questions. One, I guess, for both of you, which is to say a little bit more, and speak perhaps in a more nuanced way about how you're conceptualizing identity politics. I mean, is identity politics, for politics, the identity politics, does it have to be predicated on, say, a centralist conception of identity, or alternatively, as Anthony Appley might say, is that identity politics is predicated on the too tightly scripted conception of identity, or is identity politics any and all politics that someone like Adolph might argue abuses race, racial identity politics or identity as a political consideration. It seems to me that those are very different ways of thinking about identity politics. And if you want to say they're all identity politics, then it seems to me still important to distinguish between the kind of identity politics we're talking about, but it seems to me how we think about it. I don't know if identity politics is different, whether we're talking about one of these or the other. A second question goes more directly to Adolph. I was just wondering, I was very interested in what you were saying about the history of race relations, a discourse, and I was wondering if you would say a little bit more about what you take to be the connection between race relations discourse and identity politics. Do you think that they're internally related? Do you think that identity politics, as you understand it, in some sense reflects the history of race relations discourse, and if so, how?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think it does in some ways, right? Or at least what we think of as identity politics. And I'm going to defer to Cathy on the big question.
Okay.
And
Well, you can say what you think identity, because we may not be thinking the same thing.
well, no, well, so I was going to say, and I promise you that whatever she says, I will agree with.
Oh, wow.
So, right, I mean, as a way of defining identity politics. I mean, look, to be honest, I mean, I would just assume not have the discussion of identity politics. So I guess you ask, all right, well, then why'd you come out here? But, and I have reasons, but I mean, there's just a way in which that debate, I think, has already become too much a pro forma debate, right? And there's a kind of you say potato, I say potato quality to it. The forces on one side, throw their opponents in the bed with Haki, and the forces on the other side throw their opponents in the bed with Todd Gitlin, right? And, and I don't like either of those sleeping arrangements, but so I'm like I said, I mean, I haven't even. I've tried a little bit to think that through, but I'm not. But anyway, on the other question, yeah, I mean, at the most general level, which is therefore most likely to be banal, right? I think that that the forms of political or the modalities of political expression, which I think, frankly, or rather that we identify or that we think of as identity politics, I think are grounded ultimately in the institutional and discursive and material mechanisms that came out of the War on Poverty, the Great Society, and the emergence of Black Studies as an institution with budgets and lines and interests, and then women's studies, et cetera, in theretofore predominantly white colleges and universities over the last 30 years. And also with the emergence, and frankly, the victory, right, of a particular political regime, right, in Black American politics, but I think we've seen it also in some Latino American politics, both on the West Coast and Texas among Chicanos and elsewhere, and of course Chicago too. What am I talking about? That are tied to the mechanisms of American electoral pluralism, right? And the expansion of, or the continuance and expansion of the post-war national regime of redistribution, partial redistribution of the proceeds of publicly created economic growth, right, at the local level as well as the national level, and the sort of bad news within the good news of the victory of the civil rights movement, right? So that when Operation Push and the Urban League become line items in the Carter administration budgets, right, and these are the sources, the ostensible sources of political opposition on behalf of Black Americans, while there are tensions contradictions that are already built in. As Cathy mentioned a good while ago, black incumbents have an interest, like all incumbents, right? I mean, I think incumbents are like a race, right? I mean, they have an, right? I mean, all incumbents have an interest in keeping the number of people who can ratify or reject their claims to keep their incumbency as small as they possibly can, right? To keep it as close as they can to friends and family and people on their payrolls, right? So there's an interest. So in that sense, it's almost inevitable. Well, I shirk from teleology, but there were certainly strong tendencies, right, of a varying sorts as well as others that linked the victory of the political regime that consolidated itself in black American politics, within a decade after the Voting Rights Act, and widespread black political demobilization. This takes us back to my earliest observations about the race relations paradigm. And by the way, it's kind of interesting. It would be nice if Ken Warren had also been on this panel, since he's done this kind of work, probably going back to the turn of the 20th century as much as anybody else. Robert Knapp Moore. Oh, sorry. I mean to make you blush, man. But and I hope I don't have to sleep in the street because of that. But to go back to the point about the origins of this race relations regime at the turn of the 20th century, one continuity with the new black political regime anchored on office holding is the promise, right? Both from elected officials and from institutionally incorporated race advocacy groups, right? The two-sided promise, right? The promise on the one side to represent the interest of black Americans, to define and represent the interest of black Americans, and on the other side, to keep black Americans, or to contain the cost of maintaining social peace. And this has happened in black politics, in the women's movement, in the labor movement, in the public interest movement, in the environmental movement, right? And that's one of the reasons that I say that at the institutional level, all these movements are the equivalent of hydroponic plants, right? They're all at the top. There's no roots, right? That may not be good botany, but so. Have we run out the clock yet? I'm trying to remember.
No, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
that's very helpful. You're saying, I mean, you're saying that there's a kind of notion of the race as kind of corporate body with an interest, and that the groups aspires on one hand to be authentic to the extent that black elites, black elected officials, to the extent that they're acting on behalf of a group corporate interests, that's kind of identity politics, kind of identity, kind of authenticity politics. But at the same time, there's an orientation towards even product. So which is where the race relations comes into play.
Right.
So no. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So
I think I get it.
okay.
That's very helpful.
All right.
Okay, so I'll be very quick in terms of kind of this question of identity politics. I think, and we're not trying to blame anyone or call anybody out, but I think we both kind of resisted the idea that this would be a panel on identity politics, because I can say, at least for myself, that there's no kind of clear marker of what we mean by identity politics. There is the idea that, in fact,
You talked about how all the different modes of identity politics that were worded.
okay. I said that. You gonna let me finish, Bob, or
Well,
what?
I
Okay. So do you want to let me finish? Yo, dude. Okay. So there is a marker, if we could say, in the 1960s and 1970s, where we see the emergence of a discourse around identity politics, right? And we can also see that there's a kind of substantial literature that talks about the ways in which there's a politics surrounding groups of individuals who understand themselves to have a shared oppressed experience, responding to that experience and kind of articulating their concerns in a framework that also makes kind of primary that identity category. It could be blacks, it could be women, today it could be gays and lesbians. Now, what I think we would both kind of bristle at, so we can say that objectively we can see that this phenomenon called identity politics, and this is how, in fact, it has manifested itself in the political arena. I think we both would say we don't believe, in fact, that there's a shared perspective. There might even be, to some degree, a somewhat common experience, but the idea that there's an articulated shared perspective from that group goes back to the role of elites here and the ability to kind of dictate kind of the narrative of the experiences of that group and therefore kind of diminish the significant differences that exist within that group. And that thing becomes something that's called identity politics, right? So that's, in fact, you can agree with that?
Yeah, I told you.
But I mean, the other piece of this, right, is that for lots of different scholars, there's a question about kind of the periodization of identity politics. None of us really believe, in fact, that identity politics suddenly appears in the 1960s and 1970s. We know, in fact, that the labor movement could be called identity politics. We could say that early evangelical movements were called identity politics, right? So when we're talking about identity politics, we're talking about the phenomena that has been designated as that in the academy and trying to explain kind of, if we take identity, or what I was trying to explain is if you take something called identity politics, what are the negative implications of an identity politics as I understand it as located in the academy? Is that going to answer your question?
Somewhat.
Okay, you know what, okay. Mary?
Well, I hear a lot about what you're saying about identity politics, and I sort of bristle at that concept myself, and I've often bristled at it as a Jew a lot, having to do with identity politics. But one of the things I'm curious to hear what you both have to say is about, in terms of Obama and his movement and him as a person and a politician, is his character, because, and I thought it was really interesting, Cathy, what you said about the issue of fatherhood.
I'm not
Yeah,
saying
and-
it's bad.
No.
Leave here like I heard Cathy said Obama was a deadbeat dad. I didn't say that.
I don't think you're saying that at all, but I have been thinking a lot about the choices he's made in his own life and things like that. And as a person, you know, who has studied African American history and politics and movements and has a deep interest in it, I have had a deep sort of personal excitement about this. You know, what I do see is progress. But one of the pieces that makes me feel like there's so much progress is related to my notion of this person's character. And I don't know if he's getting a little bit of a buy because of the era that we're coming out of and because of his opponents and things like that. And so he's suffering from a low bar. You know, but I do think that, you know, having nothing to do with his race, you know, when I think about Obama, you know, I think about the intelligence and the integrity and the values and things like that. And that's why I said, and I think there's obviously a discussion to be had about values, and I think your points about Gaza are, you know, well founded, and so I'm with you on a lot of this
We
stuff.
can go down the list.
Right.
On the floor.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
I don't know what
I
his
just
values
think,
are.
right, I don't know what all of them are either, but I know that many of them are values that are maybe not maybe values isn't the right word, but I think there are characteristics about Obama that have been long absent from our national politicians, our local politicians, just black leaders in general. And so when I hear you raise questions about, you know, have we made progress? Are we moving forward? Have we made changes? And I spend my time in some of the toughest schools on the south side of Chicago, so I am surrounded by kids all day, every day, who are so excited about this. And when I think about that, and I think, I know you're excited, but I'm so thankful that you're excited about a person who I feel good about getting behind when it comes to things about intelligence and integrity, because you could so easily be excited by someone who is an awful guy, you know. And so I'm sort of thinking about
that piece of it, and I'd just be curious to know what you think.
Well, I think the
And I'm not saying the guy's perfect or that he has a perfect character.
No. I mean, I have a kind of different point than you, right? And I mean, I'm going to preface this by saying that Paul Wellstone was a dear friend of mine from college until he died, okay? And I had a lot of respect for Paul. But I say this to students all the time, right? That character questions just don't have anything at all to do with anybody who has any significant aspiration to political office in the system. I mean, anybody who aspires to any office higher than a school board in a rural area, and probably not even that, right? I mean, even a water commissioner, right, is not going to be somebody you want to have for your brother-in-law or for your sister-in-law, right? This will not be the kind of person you want to sit across the Thanksgiving turkey from. It's just not the way this thing works, right? I mean, they aren't real people in some sense. They're like holograms, right, that are created by the forces that they think they have to respond to, right? And, you know, that's what I think has been one of the crucial mistakes, right? You know, one of my greatest personal frustrations about what's happened to left politics in this country for the last 16, 18, 20 years. I mean, this notion, I don't know. I mean, I once said to a friend of mine that it seems like I forgot to set my clock back one night, and I woke up the next day, and all of a sudden the whole left had decided that we were going to elect somebody, you know, to do stuff for us. You know, I mean, we got more out of Richard Nixon, right, for the things that most of us in this room are concerned about than we got from Bill Clinton. And it's not because Nixon was a better person, obviously. It's not because Nixon cared more about us. I mean, frankly, you know, I'm sure when Clinton had his crises of conscience at 3 o'clock in the morning and tried to imagine, you know, the image of America that he wanted to see, it was a lot closer to what most of us in this room would want than Nixon's vision, because most of us wouldn't even be here in Nixon's vision. So I'd be very careful about that, right? And as far as the intelligence stuff goes, you know, I mean, I think one of the problems that maybe can be a benefit of being old is that I can remember the Kennedy administration. And pardon the crudeness, but all those smart motherfuckers there who conducted a genocide in Southeast Asia. You know, we got Summers and these guys with the economy now. You know, smart, right? You know, smart doesn't cut a lot of ice with me, actually. And in fact, it can be scary, right? Because the one thing that we know is that these pricey educations, right, and God, especially the law school ones, are all about cultivating the kind of intellectual nimbleness, right, that helps you to harmonize the principles that you want to think you hold with what gets you paid, right? And you know, so I'm sorry, but I just yeah.
I mean, I would, yes. So I would also kind of be careful of this idea of his character, and it's because I feel like, one, the bar is very low. I think, you know, a lot of what we're understanding now and the euphoria is about kind of there's no George Bush in office anymore, not just that there's Barack Obama in office. Two, you know, the idea of his values. His values to me play a role in how, in fact, he governs, and those are my concerns. And his values so far are mixed for me. His idea that, in fact, and I'm not a big supporter of gay marriage, but in fact that there's a way in which certain subjects are not allowed to have the same rights as others is problematic to me. And then to ground that in a Christian belief, to me, is actually very dangerous. Because, in fact, what's to say that the next president who decides that I don't deserve the option of an abortion and grounds their explanation in a Christian belief, you know, why do I say that Barack is okay and that person, or George Bush isn't on that question? I'll say it again, his attack on the poor, and I think, in fact, it has been at times an attack on the poor. It worries me. Now, you know, we can all talk, and we've talked about this, we can all talk about personal responsibility, But it seems to me part of the Christian ethic is you take yourself first, and part of what he has to do before he attacks other people for being personal responsible is to also talk about the privilege that he has, the ability to have kind of nannies and disposable income and private education. That gives you a certain type of ability to parent that's very different, in fact, when you're working 2 jobs and you're trying to figure out daycare and you may have just lost your job. So I think, there's a stretch there that I would like to see in terms of his values and character. I think there was one other thing I can't remember about his values and character. Which is the other thing, was not only intelligent, but one of the things I hear people saying all the time, which is he loves his wife. And I think maybe he does, I'm just not sure, again, it's relevant to my assessment of him as a president, unless what we're suggesting is we want a model of heterosexism that can in fact be modeled. And if that's the case, then I want to push back against that also. So, he loves his wife, okay. He didn't have sex with an intern. To me, the question is kind of a power differential there, not the sex. And so I think, there are all kinds of ways in which this idea that he has good values and good characters is really kind of also a normative and conservative positioning of what we're comfortable with as a country.
I want to come back to something that was on the table just a little while ago, and talk about the possibility of this election also, the opportunity that it could open for left-wing politics, precisely because, in a sense, the way I understand what's frequently called identity politics is a form of identity like nationalism that denies political economic difference. And that's why I see class as different, even though people, of course, identify as members of the class. And it's to establish a kind of a corporate entity that is undifferentiated, but is defined in terms of gender, in terms of race, etc. And that's an entire discourse that's been bracketed very strongly on the left for 30 years. Now, it could be that there were very good historical reasons why issues of identity were put on the table because they had been bracketed before. But it seems to me that precisely the election of a black president allows for a consideration of the situation of African Americans also along class lines, not only in race terms. And I think that also is going to be extremely important. By class, what I mean is political economic differentiation. I'm not trying to, sort of out of the old closet pull up a red flag of old class politics. And it seems to me that that's going to be extremely important also in considering the global situation, because terms like, as far as I'm concerned, third world or even global south really ignore massive political economic changes that have occurred in the last 20 years that involve differentiation not just among countries but within countries. And I think that the problem with the politics that only focuses on also the situations in the in what used to be called the third world, in these terms, is that you can end up with a very undifferentiated politics being supportive of groups and formations that one really shouldn't be supportive of. That it makes it much more difficult to be differentiated in terms of solidarity and non-solidarity rather than blanket form. So I think that in a funny way, that precisely this election, together with the demise of neoliberalism, could allow for a reorientation of left-wing politics that could take into account extremely important dimensions that have been bracketed.
I think that's an interesting observation. I think it's possible. I'm a political scientist, and we work back to predicting what's already happened. So I can't say about that. But Yeah, I mean, it could, but I mean, you're absolutely right, though, that a key ingredient, though, or is the demise of neoliberalism, and I think they're working overtime to patch this thing up and to keep it going. And by the way, you talk about Obama and his values. I don't know how many of you saw, but he explained that we can't nationalize the banks the way the Swedes did. I mean, even though that worked, and the Japanese model of kind of putzing around, it's kept the crisis going for a decade, because culturally, right, that's not how we do it here, right? So, yeah, it's possible. I mean, my concern there too, and yeah, I mean, I know I can. Well, I mean, I've already acknowledged I don't have any real imagination, but when I look for where the leverage is going to come from, the first place that I look is those sources that have some institutional capacity. And what I've seen in every one of these movements, I think Cathy's absolutely correct about this. They're inside the circle now, and they're part of, to put it somewhat hyperbolically, they're part of Obama's police force or the ideological police force that's pointed to the left. And yeah, for now, and the nation is leading the way, by the way, hoping, right? Because the 2 a.m. booty call just has to work harder. But I mean, you could be right? I mean, it could, yeah. I mean, I can imagine possibilities, ways that this thing could play out over the next few years that could open space. I just don't see the space now, but it's possible.
Can I ask why you think, in fact, because you started with having a black president, opens up the possibility for this discourse? Because, in fact, it seems to me that in many ways it worked to prohibit the type of discourse that you're talking about. And I would go back to kind of the symbolic nature of what Obama means for people who have maybe put aside a political agenda that would be at odds with kind of the patchwork of neoliberalism that he's engaged in right now, and instead is still focused on the idea that it's almost being kind of a race traitor to speak out against, Barack Obama right now. And that has been part of the process throughout this campaign, throughout his rise. And, so I'm just not sure how that discourse actually is opened up, and who, in fact, provides for that type of critical analysis and discussion. Because I think, now I know that there are certain organizations that I think haven't been bought off and will have to do that work within black communities. And, I have, for example, a sister who works in a factory who was an Obama supporter, but she's kind of like, well, wait a minute, I'm getting a little worried here about my job. So I think some of the reality of the economic, political, and social situation is going to kind of make even clearer the distinctions, and particular class distinctions in many communities. But the kind of idea that a black president somehow facilitates that, I don't understand. And I think, what's interesting, I just want to throw something back at, we have not talked about kind of white people's role in Barack. And there, I think it's interesting in terms of the identity politics. And I think the identity politics driving a lot of Barack is all about white people's identity.
Oh, yeah, sure.
and their hope that this is going to be
this sister
done.
back here had her hand up for a good while. Yeah.
Hope that this is going to
this
be
sister
done.
back here had her hand up for a good while. Yeah.
I was going to ask a question because Eric Holder said recently that,
Yeah.
we're a bunch of cowards when it comes to, talking about race. And, I watch way too much television considering I'm in graduate school and I was watching MSNBC. And there's a discussion
What's does
between...
math that you get more out of that?
There's a discussion between Pat Buchanan and Michael Eric Dyson. And I saw that. They're going back and forth, and just to kind of speak to what Cathy is, pointing to about white people. Pat Buchanan was saying something about, if Eric Holder wants us to have this conversation, you don't just throw around insults. You know, if I feel uncomfortable, I don't have to sit at the table. I will just walk away. And I think like this question of comfort meshes really nicely into this issue of race relations that you brought up earlier as well, because there's a way in which the way that the Obama campaign was kind of structured was in a way to make people feel comfortable about talking about race. And you know, and also like thinking about race relations as familial, you know, kind of like relations, like family relations. So, you know, Pat Buchanan said at one point during the conversation, well, you know, Michael Eric Dyson, you have to take responsibility for your black community. And Eric Dyson, you know, says back, you know, rather you take responsibility as well, you know, in a way. But, so, I mean, this is kind of all over the place, and I just want to pose this to you guys, like, what do you think in terms of this issue of comfort, in terms of, you know, talking about race? It's almost as if it's demanded that in order, like, if you are, you know, bringing up race, that it's, you know, incumbent upon you to make those that you're bringing to the table feel comfortable. Or, you know, yeah, I would just...
You know, I mean, I think one of the problems is that the categories are just too broad and too evanescent, right? Like for instance, you know, like the statement that race matters, right? Cornel West and David Duke would agree that race matters, but they mean, you know, I assume, quite different things, right? You know, on that agreement. You know, the same with, you know, with the debates about you know, the causal character of racism. Well, in fact, racism is an abstraction and is an idea, right, that doesn't cause a thing, right? There are social relations, patterns, right, that have to do with inequality or, you know, asymmetrical power that in different ways at different times are inflected through a narrative of race. And there are a lot of different kinds of those, right? And the extent to which we call all of them by the same language, you know, I think gets in the way of understanding what the actual processes are, right? Which is not to say that they don't have any, that all of them, some of them, or you know, any of them don't have something to do with racial inequality. Okay. With respect to Holder's statement, once I heard what it was, I thought, well, so what the hell does this even mean? You know, but it's like one of those cheese puff statements, right? Like, you know, I believe the children are the future, right? I mean, so, and frankly, you know, for most of American history, I don't think white people have been cowardly at all in talking about race, right? When they weren't doing that, you know, it's time to go figure out whose turn it was to bring the cotton crop in. So, I mean, but I very much take to heart your observation that this connects with the earlier discussion that we're having about the notion of race relations, because that's precisely, you know, the kind of discourse that emerges out of this framework of your race relations that sort of hopelessly clouds, you know, as you say, the language of personal transactions, right? I mean, this is how a moron like Shelby Steele, right, we can get his 15 minutes over and over and over again, right? You know, because whether the white sales clerk in Atlanta airport puts the money in his hand and looks him in the eye is, you know, or the fact that she does that is a sign that there's no more, there's no more racial inequality in the American South, right? It's just, you know, and it's only because of this clouded, this clouded kind of discourse that thing can happen. But this also speaks precisely to the point that you made about Obama and comfort. This is another anecdote. But an organization that I work with has its office in D.C., and the building is owned by two women, roughly my contemporaries, maybe a little older, feminist lawyers. They've argued cases before the Supreme Court. They're both white. And a couple of years ago, this was like, no, more than a couple of years ago, this was around the Senate race. They were hyped about Obama. And one day when I wasn't there, they were talking about him. And one of them says to my colleagues, one of the things about him that I really like is that, unlike a lot of black Americans, he doesn't have that chip on his shoulder that a lot of them have, right? I'll be honest, I haven't read the first version of Up From Slavery. I read the second one, The Audacity of Banality, or whatever it is. But I just saw not too long ago that a quoted passage from the first book where he says that he remarks that he was intrigued to learn when he was in high school, I guess, in Hawaii, how well white people respond to a black person who's articulate and doesn't seem threatening. See, now, I just got to say this about the character thing, too. It's an interesting observation about this guy in particular, because all that I've seen about him in the public record is his protean character, right? That he's been, right? I mean, it's like the Music Man in a way. I mean, it's been a constant process of invention. Felix Krull, confidence man, right? Constructing the persona with an eye always to the next level up, right? So you can call that character, okay. But yes, I mean, so there is, and I guess that speaks back to your question of Moishe's formulation, that there is a way that white people, that a lot of white people get to feel happy about themselves, but look, but in all fairness, in ways that aren't uniformly bad or disingenuous, right? I mean, it does, because it does say something about a victory of a certain kind, based on what the NAACP had been trying to do, and what I suspect most people in this room had been raised, all of their lives to think of as the goal of racial justice in America, or as a significant goal of racial justice in America. Now, I mean, just because we've been raised to think about that, it doesn't mean that it wasn't.
Right, but it is interesting that people could be, you're right, that people can be, and I want to get back to the comfort, white people can feel good, genuinely about this.
Right.
Even white people in Hyde Park, when in fact they're surrounded by black communities that are not benefiting at all, right, from an Obama effect, an Obama presidency, at least initially. Or that,
and who they depend on the police to protect them from.
Absolutely.
Right.
Or complain about when they have to take their kids to the emergency room because, in fact, there are all these poor black people who don't have insurance who are there in front of them. So it seems to me a kind of a contradiction to kind of, I had a colleague. This is my favorite story. Walk up. There are so many though, and he grabbed my hand and he said, "Congratulations." And I was like, I literally thought I had won something.
Yeah. MacArthur.
I really thought I won something, like MacArthur, right. And I was like, oh, Bill don't read my books. So I wasn't sure what I was being congratulated for, right? So, that's an extreme. We keep telling these stories.
Right.
But one of the things that I will go back to Ansley's point about is this idea of comfort, but it's also kind of, I think, a restructuring of the discussion about race and racism, right? So, and I think Barack participates in this, which is this idea, in fact, that this discussion has to be equitable, it has to be fair. We have to talk about racism, but we also have to talk about kind of black people and the threat that they pose to white people, their sometimes unwillingness to do what is right. And so I think in terms of this kind of transformation in race relations, Barack is playing a role in that. So at the end of that conversation when, Buchanan says you have to take responsibility and Eric says you have to take responsibility, it's like there's this equal dynamic here in terms of understanding power and the historical tradition of kind of the ways in which racist violence and racism has existed in part through the hands of the state in this country. And that's also, I think, something to be concerned about. I remember there were two people who made an impression when they were talking about kind of the importance of the Obama nomination. One was, I think, and I have to find the tape, I think when Kennedy was at the convention, he said that I'm supporting Barack Obama so we can have an end to discussions of sexuality and race and gender, like, okay, that, that's it. And then the night of the election, I remember Bill Bennett on CNN saying, okay, folks, that's it. You got your black president. I don't want to hear another thing from you people about like racism or inequality or discrimination. And it seemed to me very interesting that you have both Bennett and Kennedy professing at some level that the election of Barack Obama, that does it. Okay? So let's move on. Yeah.
I don't think we can move on.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I didn't mean.
We've already gone past our allotted time.
Oh.
And what's that?
Maybe one or two more if you guys
You want to take another
Okay, sure.
question?
Sure.
One more question. You can choose.
Oh, wait a minute.
I was kind of backwards at his hand up
Did
for a
Barbara
long
have her
time.
hand up? Because she had her hand up. She went home. Barbara's like, forget you.
That emerged with the institutionalization of black politics in what remained of the post-war growth regime happened to other movements. So that we accepted, for instance, what I've been calling, in an analogy to what Nelson Lichtenstein refers to as a collective bargaining regime, the permit regime, right? We have marches, right, that, we've traded building the body count at demonstrations for the possibility of disrupting normal activity, right? So we have marches that go get a permit and satisfy the authorities because, that makes it more possible for us to build a body count at the march. And then they've gotten a lot smarter about this stuff too, so they herd us down streets where nobody will be, where we don't disrupt traffic, and we go into a park where nobody is present but us. So we have to evolve self-entertainment culture, right, like the turtles and stuff, right? And I mean, I don't really go to those things anymore, but in
You're just keeping informed.
well, yeah, in their honor, like on the morning of the march, I will in the shower maybe give some of the speeches, right, because I know them all, right? As I look out at this sea of faces today, young, old, black, white, men, women, gay, straight, we're going to send a message to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we all go home, right? And now that's one strain. The other strain is the smarter than the old school 60s activist types, right? Who understand, right? By virtue of adoption of the sort of neo-Alinskyite SEIU style style of organizing and trade unionism, right? A sort of latter-day syndicalism. That commitment to a larger objective than something that can conceivably be won in the next 2 weeks or so, or in the next cycle of Congress, is naive and armchair activism, right? This kind of feeds nicely, right, into a career trajectory that enables people to move from union staffs to public interest group staffs to congressional staffs, and there's a culture around this, right? Right? I mean, there's a new movement or activist-based, a new activist-based petite bourgeoisie. 2 words might help to condense an image. Samantha Power. So there's that, right? So I mean, in this context, this is the context of what's happened to the New Left, right? And so how that has to, well, I'm kind of puzzling over the question of the impact on how the New Left ontologizes race, since race is an ontological notion in the first place, right? I mean, that might be something more interesting to discuss over a glass of wine. But did I address in some way all three of the questions, or?
Can I?
Okay. Mhm.
I just want to say two things about the question. One is, I think Adolph was right when he started with what new left almost anymore. I think to continue to kind of fetishize the new left as opposed to understanding the different forms of mobilization that we see both on the ground and online is a real mistake. And I think what the Obama presidency may do is to have the academy actually catch up with what, in fact, is happening outside of the academy with regards to organizing. That it is no longer just a game of the old left or the new left, but in fact, and we may not like it in terms of kind of the ideological fluidity almost of these movements and activists, but I think those categories, while helpful to us in terms of kind of the literature that we refer to, doesn't really map on to kind of what we're seeing in terms of the type of mobilization. Now, that may mean that the mobilization in terms of kind of truly transformative ability doesn't exist anymore. But I would take issue with some of Adolph's characterizations of what's happening in terms of the mobilization from groups like Insight or Critical Resistance, and these are groups, not movements. But in fact, often we call something a movement like 40 years later when we're able to see kind of the connections between groups.
Or when they build something.
Right, we generally don't start with say,
institutionalized
here's the movement.
Can have some
anyway,
capacity and can assert their will politically.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
No, I just felt bad for
I
asking.
think we really have to.
Yes.
And this could have gone on for a very long time. I wish we could.
Thank you very much, my sister.
I think what we should do is